My daughter-in-law refuses to let me hold my newborn grandson. I don't beg. I just stop funding the luxury nursery she demanded. My name is Eleanor Whitfield. I am 79 years old. And I have buried a husband, raised a son alone for the last 12 years of his childhood, and built a small furniture business from nothing but a garage and a stubborn will. I tell you this so you understand. Something about me, before I tell you what happens next. I am not a woman who begs. I never have been. Not when my husband, Richard, passed and left me with a mortgage and a 9-year-old boy. Not when the bank told me twice that my loan for the workshop was denied. And I am certainly not about to start begging a 31-year-old woman named Brianna Kessler to let me hold my own grandson. It starts on a Tuesday afternoon in April. I drive 40 minutes to my son, Gregory's house, the one I helped him buy the down payment for. Carrying a soft yellow blanket, I knitted myself over 6 weeks, my arthritis screaming in my knuckles with every stitch. Henry is 4 days old, my first grandchild. I have waited 51 years of my life, since the day I first imagined being a grandmother, for this moment. Brianna answers the door in a silk robe that costs more than my monthly grocery budget. Her hair perfectly styled even 4 days postpartum. And she looks at the blanket in my hands like I've brought her something from a thrift store dumpster. Now isn't a good time, Eleanor, she says. Not mom, never mom. Always Eleanor. Said the way you'd say the name of a distant coworker you don't particularly like. I just want to see him for a few minutes, I say. I won't stay long. He's sleeping. And honestly, we're trying to limit visitors right now. Germs, you know. I stand on that porch in the April chill for exactly 30 seconds longer than I should have. And then I nod and I turn around and I drive home with the blanket still folded on the passenger seat. That would have been fine. Truly, it would have been fine if it had been the only time. New mothers are protective. I understand that. I was protective once too, when Gregory was born, snapping at my own mother-in-law for holding him too long, for humming the wrong lullaby. Motherhood does something to a woman's nerves in those first weeks. I was prepared to forgive one closed door. But it is not one closed door. It is 6 weeks of closed doors. 6 weeks of now isn't a good time. 6 weeks of video calls that last 90 seconds before Brianna finds a reason to end them. 6 weeks of my son, my own son who I raised by myself after his father died, calling me apologetically from his car in the driveway because he isn't even allowed to talk about it inside his own house. She's just adjusting, Mom, Gregory tells me on one of these calls. It's a lot for her. Give her time. I've given her 6 weeks, Gregory. I know. Just a little longer. And here's the part that really lodges itself under my skin like a splinter. I can't dig out. During these same 6 weeks, while I'm being told I cannot hold my grandson because germs, because timing, because she's adjusting, Brianna posts photograph after photograph on her social media. Henry in a $5,000 crib shaped like a cloud. Henry surrounded by her sorority sisters at a Meet the Baby brunch. Henry in the arms of Brianna's own mother, who apparently drove in from 3 states away and stayed in the guest room for 2 entire weeks, holding him, feeding him, rocking him to sleep in the nursery. The nursery. I should explain about the nursery because that's where this story really begins to turn. When Brianna was 7 months pregnant, she and Gregory came to me for money. Not the first time. Understand? Gregory had already come to me twice before that for help with the mortgage after a rough patch at his job, and I gave it gladly, because that is what mothers do. But this time, it was different. This time, Brianna sat across from me at my kitchen table with a tablet full of Pinterest boards and interior design mock-ups, and she explained, in the tone of someone explaining something to a child, that the nursery needed to be elevated. A custom hand-painted mural of a forest scene, $11,000. A designer crib imported from Italy. A rocking chair upholstered in Belgian linen. A changing table that was, and I am not exaggerating, more expensive than the first car I ever owned. The total came to just under $43,000. We really think this matters for his development, Brianna told me, tapping the tablet. The aesthetic environment shapes a child's brain in the early years. I read a whole study on it. I looked at my son. Gregory would not meet my eyes. He stared at his coffee cup and said nothing, which told me everything I needed to know about who was making decisions in that household. I want to tell you that I said no. I want to tell you I was wise enough, tough enough, to see the writing on the wall right there at my own kitchen table. But I didn't. I looked at the ultrasound photo Brianna had also brought, tucked in a plastic sleeve. My first grandchild curled up like a comma inside her. And I thought about how much I wanted to be part of this baby's life, how much I wanted Brianna to like me, to trust me, to let me in. So I wrote the check. $43,000. Money I had saved slowly across a decade of running my furniture shop. Money I had earmarked, if I'm honest, for the very real possibility that I would need it myself one day for a nursing home or a hip replacement or some other indignity of old age. I gave it to her anyway. And now, 6 weeks after Henry's birth, I have been in the same room as my grandson for a grand total of 4 minutes, standing in a doorway, not permitted past the threshold, while Brianna's mother gets a guest room and unlimited holding privileges, and brunch photographs with a baby wrapped in a blanket I didn't knit. I am not a woman who cries easily. Richard used to say I had flint where other people have tear ducts. But I sat in my car in Gregory's driveway after that 6-week video call, the one where Brianna walked past the camera, holding Henry, and didn't even angle him toward the screen. And I cried until my chest hurt. Then I stopped crying, and I did something else instead. I got angry. And when I get angry, I don't yell. I plan. The next morning, I call my accountant, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Carol, who has managed my books for 18 years. I tell her to look into the nursery fund, the remaining balance that had been earmarked for phase 2, which was apparently going to include a custom bookshelf, shaped like a hot air balloon, and a $10,000 rug that Brianna had sent me a link to just 2 weeks before Henry was born, with a message that said, simply, this would be perfect. Thanks in advance, 3 exclamation points, as if it were already decided. As if I were an ATM with a pulse, there is $19,000 remaining in that account, money that was sitting there, waiting to be spent on things I would never be allowed to sit near. I call the bank, and I freeze the transfer. Then I call Gregory. I need to talk to you about the nursery fund. I say, Mom, is everything okay? I'm pulling the remaining money. The rug, the bookshelf, whatever else is on that list. I won't be paying for it. There is a long silence on the line. I can hear him breathing, and I can picture him exactly, standing in the garage probably, because that's where he goes now to have any conversation that might upset Brianna, hiding in his own house like a teenager sneaking a phone call. Mom, why would you do that? We already told Brianna it was coming. Then you and Brianna can untell her, or you can figure out another way to pay for a $10,000 rug. I raised you on a waitress's tips and a workshop that almost went bankrupt twice. You'll survive without the rug, Gregory. This isn't like you. You're right. I say, it isn't like me to fund a nursery for a grandchild I'm not allowed to hold, so I'm becoming a different version of myself, one who keeps her money for people who actually want her around. He doesn't have a response to that. I let the silence sit there for a moment, and then I say goodnight and I hang up. I wish I could tell you that this single act of quiet defiance immediately fixed everything, that Brianna had some grand realization about her behavior and opened her arms to me. That is not what happens. What happens instead is war. Within an hour of that phone call, my phone rings, and it is Brianna, which is itself unusual because Brianna never calls me. Brianna communicates through Gregory, like I am a foreign dignitary requiring official channels. Eleanor, she says, and her voice has an edge to it I've never heard directed at me before, though I imagine she uses it plenty on other people. Gregory says you're pulling the money for the nursery. That's correct. We already committed to that furniture. Do you understand how that looks, backing out now? I understand exactly how it looks, I say. It looks like a grandmother who has been kept from her grandson for 6 weeks deciding she'd rather keep her. Retirement savings than Fund A, rug for a room she isn't allowed to stand in. That is not fair. I've had a very difficult postpartum recovery, Eleanor, and I raised a child alone after burying my husband, Brianna. I know what difficult looks like. What I don't know is why every single person in your family gets to hold my grandson except me. She doesn't have an answer for that. Instead, she says coldly, fine, we'll figure it out ourselves, and hangs up. For the next month, the silence from that household is total. No calls, no photos, no updates. Gregory texts me once a week, brief, guarded messages. Henry's doing great, growing fast. The kind of update you'd send an acquaintance, not your mother. I do not chase it. I do not call daily begging for scraps of information about my own grandson, though God knows I want to. I have decided that if I'm going to be shut out, I will not do it while also humiliating myself. I go back to my shop. I refinish an oak dresser for a young couple starting their first home together, and I think with some bitterness about how much easier it is to be generous with strangers than with your own family. During that same silent month, I keep myself busy the only way I know how, with work. I take on a bigger project than I probably should have at my age, restoring a set of 6 antique dining chairs for a family 2 towns over, sanding and staining, late into the evening because my hands need something to do besides sit folded, in my lap thinking about a baby I'm not allowed to see. My employee, a young man named Marcus, who has worked in my shop for 3 years, notices something is wrong. He's not the type to pry, but one evening, as I'm scraping old varnish off a chair leg with more force than the job requires, he sets down his own tools and says, "You've been quiet lately? Ms. Whitfield, everything all right at home?" I almost brush him off, the way I brush off most people who ask after my personal life. But something about the gentleness in his voice loosens something in my chest, and I find myself telling him, briefly, about the nursery money, about the closed doors, about a grandson I've held for exactly 4 minutes since he was born. Marcus listens without interrupting, and when I finish, he says something I carry with me for a long time afterward. My mother used to say that the people who slam doors the hardest are usually the ones who are the most afraid of what's on the other side of them. I don't know if that's true. I don't know much of anything those weeks, but it stays with me, turning over in my mind while I sand wood, and try not to check my phone every 10 minutes for a message that never comes. There are nights during that month where I sit alone in my house, the one Richard and I bought together 40 years ago, and I take out the photo albums from when Gregory was small. I look at pictures of him as a baby, myself holding him at the exact age Henry is now, my hair dark and my face unlined. Richard standing beside me with his hand on my shoulder, both of us grinning like we'd been handed the whole world in a 5-pound bundle. I think about how much I wanted, back then, to give my own son every advantage I never had growing up poor in a mill town. I think about how that same impulse, decades later, is what made me write a check for $43,000 without asking a single hard question first. Wanting to be needed can make a person foolish, even a person who prides herself on never being foolish. It is during this month of silence that I begin hearing things, not from Gregory, who has gone quiet as a shadow, but from my sister Dorothy, whose daughter is friends with someone in Brianna's social circle, because in a town this size, everyone is eventually connected to everyone else by 2 or 3 degrees. Dorothy tells me over coffee, careful and hesitant, that Brianna has been telling people a very different version of events, that I am controlling, that I tried to dictate how the nursery should look and got upset when Brianna wanted her own vision, that I have been cold and distant since the baby was born, uninterested, and that cutting the money was proof of how conditional my love had always been. I sit with that for a long moment, my coffee going cold in front of me. "That's not what happened," I say. "I know, Eleanor," Dorothy says gently. "I've known you 60 years. I know exactly what kind of mother and grandmother you are. But that's the story going around. I could have let this destroy me. There is a version of this story where I spiral into bitterness, where I spend my remaining years estranged from my only son and grandson, nursing a grudge until it calcifies into something permanent and ugly. I have seen it happen to other women my age. Grief and anger left unattended, hardened like clay left out in the sun. But I did not raise Gregory to be a quitter, and I did not raise myself to be one either. So instead, I do something that surprises even me. I invite Gregory to lunch, just Gregory, no Brianna, at the diner where I used to take him every Friday after school when he was a boy, back when it was just the 2 of us against the world. He looks tired when he arrives, older than his 34 years. There are circles under his eyes that speak of sleepless nights, and not just from the baby. "Mom," he says, sliding into the booth, "I don't want to fight." "I don't either," I say. "I want to understand what happened to my son." He looks down at the menu he isn't going to order from. "It's complicated." "Then uncomplicate it for me. I'm your mother. I changed your diapers and paid your college deposit and sat with you in the ER when you broke, your arm falling off that garage roof you weren't supposed to be on. Tell me the truth, Gregory." And slowly, hesitantly, like a man unburdening something he's been carrying alone for months, he does. He tells me that Brianna has struggled since the birth, not just physically, but with something deeper, something he's been afraid to name out loud. Sleepless nights that turned into weeks of not eating properly, of crying in the bathroom with the fan running so he wouldn't hear. He tells me that her own mother, staying those 2 weeks, wasn't generosity or favoritism toward me being excluded. It was because Brianna had asked for her, specifically because in the fog of those early weeks, she trusted her own mother's voice more than anyone else's, including his. He tells me that keeping visitors limited, including me, wasn't really about germs or timing at all. It was about control. One of the only things Brianna felt she still had in a body and a life that suddenly felt unrecognizable to her. She's not doing well, Mom, he says quietly. I think it might be postpartum depression. Maybe anxiety on top of it. She won't say the words out loud, but I've read about it, and it fits. I didn't know how to explain any of this to you without it sounding like I was making excuses for how she treated you, so I just didn't explain it. I let you think it was about you. I sit in that booth and feel something shift inside my chest. Not forgiveness yet. Not entirely, but understanding, which is often the door forgiveness walks through. Why didn't you tell me sooner? I ask. Because I was ashamed, he admits. Ashamed that I couldn't fix it. Ashamed that my wife didn't want my mother around during the best thing that's ever happened to us. Ashamed that I let it get this far without saying anything. I reach across the table and take his hand, the same hand I held crossing streets 40 years ago. You should have told me, I say. I'm your mother. I don't need you to protect me from hard truths. I need you to trust me with them. He nods, and for the first time in 2 months, I see something like relief cross his face. There's something else, he says, and I brace myself because his voice has taken on the careful tone he used to use as a boy right before, confessing to something he'd broken. Brianna's mother staying those 2 weeks? It wasn't just because Brianna asked for her. It's because her mother went through something similar after Brianna was born. Bad postpartum depression, the kind that needed hospitalization for a short time. Brianna's terrified of it. She's been terrified since before she even got pregnant. Honestly, and I don't think either of us really understood how much fear she was carrying into this until it was already happening to her. She didn't want anyone to see her struggling, especially not you, because she wanted so badly to prove to herself that she wasn't going to end up the same way her mother did. I feel something soften even further inside my chest, hearing this. That poor girl, I say quietly, and I mean it without a trace of the bitterness I'd been carrying for weeks. Why would she think I'd judge her for something like that? I don't think it was about you specifically. Mom, I think by the time you showed up wanting to hold Henry, she'd already built a wall so high she couldn't figure out how to let anyone through it, including me some days. He turns his coffee cup slowly on the table, not drinking it. I should have pushed harder. I should have called you the first week and told you the truth, instead of letting you think it was about the nursery or about you not being wanted. That's on me, not her. It's on both of you a little, I say, but gently, and a little on me too, for assuming the worst instead of asking. We all did this to each other, Gregory. Now let's see if we can undo it. I don't fix everything with that lunch. I want to be honest with you about that, because life rarely resolves itself in one clean conversation, no matter how much we wish it did. But it is a beginning. I ask Gregory if I can see Henry, not demand. Ask and tell him I understand if Brianna isn't ready, but that I would like to try. Gently, on her terms this time, not mine. 2 days later, Gregory calls and asks if I would come by on Saturday, just for a short visit. Brianna knows I'm coming. I almost don't recognize the woman who opens the door. Brianna looks thinner than she did 6 weeks ago, her hair pulled back in a simple knot instead of styled, dark circles beneath eyes that used to look at me with such cool detachment. Now they just look tired, exhausted in a way that goes beyond sleep deprivation. Hi, Eleanor, she says, and her voice is quieter than I've ever heard it. Thank you for coming. Thank you for having me, I say, and I mean it. She lets me in, and there, in a bassinet, in the living room, not the elevated nursery with its imported crib and forest mural, but the ordinary living room, because apparently that's where he's been sleeping most nights. Close to his mother is Henry, 7 weeks old, fists curled up by his face the way newborns do, as if they're still bracing for a world they haven't fully arrived in yet. Would you like to hold him? Brianna asks, and her voice cracks slightly on the question. I don't trust myself to speak, so I just nod. She lifts him carefully and places him in my arms, and I feel the weight of him settle against me. That particular newborn weight that is somehow both nothing and everything at once. And I look down at this small, unbelievable person who carries pieces of my husband's face in his tiny features. And I finally, after 7 long weeks, become a grandmother in more than name. Brianna sits down across from me, wringing her hands, and after a moment she says, I owe you an apology. Several, actually. You don't have to do this right now, I tell her, not looking up from Henry's face. I do. I've been keeping everyone at a distance, not just you. I told myself it was about protecting him, protecting some perfect version of motherhood I had in my head. But really, I think I was drowning, and I didn't know how to say that out loud, so I just controlled the things I could control. Who came in? Who held him? It wasn't about you not deserving to hold your grandson, Eleanor. It was never about that. I'm sorry it felt that way. I'm sorry too, I say, for pulling the money out of anger instead of talking to you first. That wasn't fair of me either, not knowing what you were going through. No, she says, shaking her head. You didn't do anything wrong. I made you feel like an outsider in your own grandson's life. The money? Honestly, the money doesn't matter. We didn't need that rug. I don't even know why I wanted it so badly. I think I just wanted to feel like I was building something perfect, because everything else felt like it was falling apart. We sit there for a long while, the 3 generations of this family in one room. Me, my son, his wife, and the newest addition sleeping soundly in my arms. And something mends that I honestly wasn't sure could be mended. In the weeks that follow, Brianna finally speaks to her doctor, who confirms what Gregory suspected: postpartum depression, treatable, manageable, but requiring real support, not silence and closed doors. I begin coming by twice a week, not to fund luxury nurseries, but to hold my grandson, to make Brianna a pot of soup, to sit with her while she cries when the exhaustion gets to be too much, to be simply present. Gregory tells me later that having his mother back, really back, not performing politeness through a screen door, was one of the things that helped Brianna feel less alone in those difficult months. I never did give them that money for the rug, but I gave them something I think mattered more in the end, which was patience and honesty, and the willingness to sit in a hard conversation instead of writing checks to smooth it over. Henry is 8 months old now. He has my late husband's stubborn chin and Brianna's quick, curious eyes, and every single Sunday. Without fail, I'm there holding him. No doorway between us anymore. There is one more thing I should tell you before I close this out. A few months after that Saturday afternoon with the bassinet in the living room, Brianna came to my house alone. Without Gregory, without Henry, just her, standing on my porch the way I had once stood on hers. She had a small wrapped box in her hands, and when I opened it, I found a photo frame, hand-painted with tiny flowers around the edges. And inside, it was a picture of the 2 of us, her and me, sitting together on her couch, each of us holding one of Henry's small hands between us while he slept between us on a blanket. I didn't even remember that photo being taken. Gregory must have snapped it quietly from across the room. I wanted you to have this, she said, because I think it's the moment I actually started letting you in. Instead of just tolerating you being there, I wanted to say thank you for not giving up on us. A lot of people would have. I gave you plenty of reasons too. I invited her in for tea that afternoon, and we sat at my kitchen table, the same table where she'd once shown me a tablet full of Pinterest boards for a nursery that never got its imported rug. And this time, we talked about nothing important at all. Henry's first laugh. Whether he had Richard's chin or Gregory's, what kind of birthday cake to make for his first birthday, months away still, but already, apparently, a subject Brianna had strong opinions about. It was such an ordinary conversation, the kind mothers and daughters-in-law have all over the world every single day. And I remember thinking, sitting there with my tea going lukewarm in front of me, that I had never in my life been so grateful for something so plain and unremarkable. I think about those 6 weeks sometimes, the ones where I stood on a porch with a hand-knitted blanket and was told it wasn't a good time. I understand now that the story I told myself in that moment, that I was being rejected, that I didn't matter, wasn't the whole truth. There was pain underneath that closed door that had nothing to do with me at all. I'm glad. I didn't let my hurt calcify into something permanent before I found that out. I'm glad I chose to sit down at a diner booth instead of walking away for good. If you're a grandmother out there feeling shut out, feeling like the door keeps closing no matter how much love you're offering, I want you to hear this. Sometimes it truly is about you, and you're allowed to protect your peace and your resources when that's the case. But sometimes there's a whole storm happening behind that door that nobody's told you about yet. Ask before you assume. Sit down before you walk away. You might be surprised what you find on the other side. Money can buy a lot of things. A fancy crib, an imported rug, a hand-painted mural on a nursery wall. but it cannot buy a place in a family that's hurting quietly behind a closed door. Only patience can do that. Only showing up again and again, even when it's hard, even when your pride tells you to stay home. So tell me, where are you watching from tonight? Drop your city in the comments below. I read every single one of them. And if you love your grandma, if she's ever fought her way back into a room she wasn't sure she was welcome in, hit that like button, subscribe for more stories like this one, and share it with someone who needs to hear it. I'll see you in the next story.